Welcome to Sutra Study. This course is offered for Sugar Plum Sangha's 2020 Rains Retreat and is on the discourse on the four establishments of mindfulness and the discourse on the full awareness of breathing. It's thanks to these two discourses that the practice of mindfulness meditation has been handed down by generations of practitioners. And they're the foundation for the Plum Village community of engaged Buddhism, which is the community that Sugar Plum Sangha practices in. We're offering this course to provide mindfulness practitioners of all kinds, whether they practice in a Buddhist tradition or a secular application, with a detailed map to help navigate the landscapes of body and mind and root their practice within the context of a path that, if integrated into one's life, can give rise to the deepest kinds of wellness and fulfillment. This course will offer lectures and guided meditations, concrete practices on and off the cushion, and suggested readings for experiencing each of the exercises that are given in the discourse on the four establishments of mindfulness and the discourse on the full awareness of breathing, called satipatthana and anapanasati, respectively. So it's suggested that we spend a week on each exercise so that we can really take the time to develop proficiency in the technique and experience its fruits. If you're a beginning meditator, you'll benefit from clear guidance in basic meditation practices, all the way from bare awareness of the breath up to contemplation of the Four Noble Truths. And if you are a more experienced meditator, it may help to cultivate some structure and focus in your practice and return to familiar exercises with fresh eyes. So this first lesson will provide a working definition for mindfulness within the context of the Buddha's teaching. And we'll do that by surveying mindfulness's key features and its place within a broader path of practice, leading one to the complete letting go. The complete letting go of frustration and disappointment with life. So this will be the most didactic of all the lessons, just so we can begin with a correct understanding of terms and how they relate to each other. And then from here, each lesson will focus on direct experiences of the meditation techniques taught in the discourses and strategies for integrating those experiences into daily life. We've called this course Sati, remembering who you are, because Sati is the Pali word that has been translated as mindfulness and is the topic of both the anapanasati and satipatthana suttas. Just a quick note on Pali. Pali is one of the languages the early Buddhist teachings were written down in. And today, the Pali Canon, which consists of discourses called Nikayas that were given by the Buddha and his prominent disciples, rules for monastic life and governing the Sangha, and later commentaries and compendiums, is the most complete record that survives of the early Buddhist teachings. So these are the texts that set the doctrine for the Theravada school of Buddhism. If you've been practicing in the Plum Village tradition or another Mahayana school, you may be more familiar with the Sanskrit version of Buddhist terms. And that's because surviving Mahayana schools trace their lineage back to schools that wrote their discourses, which are called agamas, down in Sanskrit and other languages. These versions of the canon have mostly been lost in their original languages, but have been preserved in Chinese. So for the most part, I'll provide the Pali terms because they are easier to reference. And this is because the entire Pali Canon has been translated into English. It's very easy to enter a Pali term into Google and be taken to a relevant Buddhist discourse. It's more difficult with Sanskrit, however. since although they've been translated in Chinese, English translations are lagging behind. Okay, so that ended up being more than a quick note on Pali. One of the delightful, although unintended, consequences of studying the suttas is that it has turned me into a bit of a language nerd. But moving on. Why remembering who you are? Well, that's because that's what mindfulness is. It's a way of remembering who you are. Or more correctly, who you are not. As we'll see, the meditation techniques in the discourses on the 4 establishments of mindfulness and on the full awareness of breathing systematically deconstruct any and every aspect of experience that we might be tempted to identify with. But in realizing what we are not, we realize what we are, which is totally unbound. For the Buddha, liberation from the frustration and disappointments of life, which is dukkha in Pali, usually translated as suffering, realization of unbinding resulted from a complete letting go of self-concepts. All right, we got the next slide. So meditation is life. It's a path for bringing body, breath, and mind in oneness so that we can be unified, totally ourselves in the present moment. As a discipline, meditation cultivates mindfulness or skill in observing the moment-by-moment unfolding of life, concentration or skill in directing attention and maintaining a calm and lucid awareness, and insight or a penetrative understanding into the making of and release from suffering. These 3 characteristics together are the soil from which a life of satisfaction and fulfillment sprout. Or in the Buddha's words, as recorded in the Satipatthana, there is a most wonderful way to help living beings realize purification, overcome directly grief and sorrow, end pain and anxiety, and realize nirvana. This is the way of the 4 establishments of mindfulness. So it's from the beginning of the Satipatthana, and already the Buddha describes the purpose for which a spiritual life is lived: to overcome directly grief and sorrow, to end pain and anxiety, and to realize nirvana. So he introduces us to the 2 forces that have animated all of human life, dukkha and nirvana. And here I'm using the Sanskrit because that's what's most common for us, but in Pali, nirvana is nibbana. Dukkha is usually translated as suffering, but this translation is a little misleading. For a more nuanced understanding, it helps to know the Buddha's definition. And so this appears in many, many discourses. Birth is dukkha, aging is dukkha, death is dukkha, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair are dukkha. Association with the unbeloved is dukkha, separation from the loved is dukkha, not getting what is wanted is dukkha. In short, the 5 clinging aggregates are dukkha. So when the Buddha was defining dukkha, he was describing the universal aspects of the human condition, the facts of life. He was saying that the tragedy of life is that we are born into these fragile bodies with minds that are constantly searching for stability and permanence, but can't find it anywhere. So that's why suffering is a misleading translation. We can get caught in the idea that life is suffering, and then we think that the only way to end suffering is to end birth, at least in the human sense. And this has been the understanding of many schools of Buddhism. But instead, I think we can come to realize that although suffering is the state we are born into, it is not how we have to live. Dukkha is an experience, and like all experience, it comes and it goes, dependent on conditions. So that's why I prefer translations like unsatisfactory or disappointing to suffering. We can notice how it feels different to say life is disappointing rather than life is suffering. When I say life is disappointing, it shines light on my own expectations, on my own reactions, and on my own attitudes. And that's empowering because these are things I can change. But when I say life is suffering, then I feel like I'm just a victim, some higher power beyond myself. Notice too how it feels different to say the end of suffering instead of the end of disappointment. So it's hard to imagine how we can end the suffering that comes with birth and sickness and old age and struggle and loss and death. But we can end the disappointment and the frustration that comes with these experiences. Rather than these experiences being evidence that life is broken or incomplete or unsatisfying, they become a source of cohesion and solidarity and compassion among other beings. And so rather than clenching around ourselves, that's the 5 clinging aggregates that's mentioned, our task becomes to embrace the whole of life rather than resisting suffering. Mindfulness, the Buddha says, is the way to relax our grip around ourselves. And when we relax that grip, we make way for a life of fulfillment and satisfaction. But what is mindfulness? Many people today are familiar with modern definitions of the ancient Pali word sati. The popular Headspace meditation app defines it as the quality of being present and fully engaged with whatever we're doing at the moment, free from distraction or judgment, and aware of our thoughts and feelings without getting caught up in them. Brown and Ryan, who developed the Mindful Attention Awareness Scale, describe it as open or receptive awareness and attention to what is taking place in the present. Mindful Magazine says that mindfulness is the basic human ability to be fully present, aware of where we are and what we're doing, and not overly reactive or overwhelmed by what's going on around us. Mindfulness is a quality that every human being already possesses. It's not something you have to conjure up, you just have to learn how to access it. And one more from Psychology Today calls mindfulness a state of active, open attention to the present. This state is described as observing one's thoughts and feelings without judging them as good or bad. So do those sound familiar? So among these definitions, we can draw out the common themes of present moment awareness, calm and balance, and non-judgment. And these can be helpful definitions, especially as an addition to other therapeutic and wellness practices. This aspect of mindfulness can help to gain insight into one's own conditioning and create a space in between stimulus and action where we can reprogram that conditioning. What these definitions lack, however, is what one does in that space to bring about the transformations we are seeking. They also beg the question, how are we actually to live a life that is totally absorbed in the present in a way that is devoid of judgment or discernment? For example, how are we to plan for the future, choose a career, or arrange for our safety without any thought of the future? How can we set boundaries around our relationships in our lives if we are to ignore all past behavior? And how are we to discern what is ethical or moral if all judgment is suspended? This kind of crazy wisdom that we've seen result in a lot of scandals. So these are the sorts of definitions that have been helping many people and have proliferated in our culture. Mindfulness meditation has been exploding in mindfulness culture, in mainstream culture, finding its way into the landscapes of mental health treatment and business, spirituality, technology, environmentalism, the military. The world now has more meditators even than before, even than in the Buddha's time. But many practitioners remain confused about these types of questions. And we also have to wonder if the military is teaching mindfulness for the sake of complete liberation of mind, or if corporations are teaching it for the letting go of all craving. Even clinicians and other providers in the helping professions may be teaching mindfulness to bring about outcomes other than what the Buddha intended, if their aim is to make progress towards worldly goals. But this isn't to say that mindfulness practice is all or nothing. The Buddha himself offered many teachings and practical advice for people who weren't yet practicing for total unbinding. And there's a reason why these forms of mindfulness have spread the world over, because some of them help people, really, really help people. This is just to say that whatever kind of practitioner we are, it helps to know what we are practicing for so that we know which aspects of mindfulness to emphasize and not get distracted by unhelpful questions. The discourses we are studying here lay out the path for the complete ending of frustration and dissatisfaction, so that's what we're going to emphasize. The Buddha was born a Kshatriya. Forgive my pronunciation if there are any Sanskrit scholars listening. And the Kshatriyas were the class of warriors in the Indian caste system. He was born into a clan of Shakyans in northern India. The Kshatriya were the rulers of the many states that spread across the subcontinent. And contrary to popular myth, the Buddha was not a prince. The Shakyans had once been an independent republic, but had since been annexed by the neighboring kingdom of Koshala, and thus were obliged to pay taxes to the kingdom and supply it with men for the military. The day-to-day affairs of the Shakyans were governed by a council of members from noble families, of which the Buddha's father, Suddhodana, was chief. Though he wasn't a prince, the Buddha still would have grown up privileged in society, so the stage was set for his later becoming disillusioned with living merely to gratify his moment-to-moment desires, and that set the stage for him to go wandering as an ascetic and eventually realize unbinding. Even before delivering the discourses on the four establishments of mindfulness and the full awareness of breathing, the Buddha mentions sati and many other earlier teachings. In the beginning of the anapanasati, he says that there are already monastics practicing the four establishments of mindfulness. But these are the two discourses that most completely explain sati and lay out the complete method of practice for its development. In the satipatthana, the Buddha outlines 21 specific exercises, 21 by my count and how I categorize them, but you could group them differently. 21 specific exercises that he claims help living beings realize purification, overcome directly grief and sorrow, and pain and anxiety, travel the right path, and realize nirvana. Each of these exercises can be practiced in the framework outlined in the Anapanasati Sutta, which is a series of guided meditations the Buddha gave using the breath to develop lucid states of concentration. And the concentration creates the conditions for insight into the nature of the body, feelings, mental formations, and consciousness. When we put these two discourses together, it provides a complete path of practice for living an awakened and fulfilling life. So let's look at this word sati, what it actually means. The noun sati is related to the verb sarati, which means to remember. There are many cases in which the Buddha does describe sati as having something to do with memory. In the Samyutta Nikaya 48.10, he says that one who is mindful is able to remember what was said or done even long ago. Mindfulness is also the quality with which he instructs disciples to hear his discourses and pay close attention, so that they may remember them well. We can imagine how important mindfulness was in spreading the teaching in pre-modern India. Before instant retrieval provided by the internet, and even before the teachings were ever written down, practitioners had only what they could remember from what they heard the Buddha or another monastic say to guide them in their practice. And then besides remembering it for themselves, practitioners were also tasked with cultivating mindfulness so they could correctly relay the teaching on to others. So not only was mindfulness essential for guiding one's personal practice, it was also an essential component to forming and maintaining the Sangha. As we study on, we quickly realize that mindfulness isn't merely memory, though. Practice can show us this as well. Many of us might already have the insight of making great effort to stay mindful while constantly being distracted by memories from the past. So what the discourses actually depict is a relationship between sati and memory, in which mindfulness enhances memory, so that information that is helpful in advancing in the practice can be stored and recalled and analyzed. According to Thanissaro Bhikkhu, awakening is like a mountain on the horizon, and mindfulness is remembering the directions for how to get there. This analogy suggests that there are right and wrong ways to be mindful, an idea that is supported by the existence of the term mikchasati, meaning wrong mindfulness. Wrong mindfulness is simply being mindful in a way that causes detrimental mental qualities to increase. As a practice for unbinding, then, sati is more than remembering. Rather, it is concerned with what is remembered. And this what is the subject of the satipatthana and anapanasati suttas. The two discourses tell us to keep four things in mind: the body, which is kaya in Pali, feeling, which is vedana, mind states, chitta, and dhamma. The fourth category, which is dhamma, I am leaving untranslated, because no translation seems complete enough. In the Satipatthana, we are presented with a list of Buddhist teachings that appear frequently in the discourses as examples of Dhamma. And in the Anapanasati, we are guided to contemplating the essential qualities of phenomena, such as impermanence, etc., as examples of Dhamma. It seems that the instructions are to regard whatever object of mind that arises in the present moment in terms of these teachings and natural patterns. So I leave it untranslated so that it can refer to any and all of these contexts. And so just to summarize, the body, feeling, mind states, and Dhamma are what we call the four establishments of mindfulness. and they form the bulk of the Satipatthana and Anapanasati suttas. Bhikkhu Analayo has a helpful analysis of the Satipatthana Sutta, in which he identifies what he calls the definition section and the refrain. The definition lists the defining qualities of mindfulness, and the refrain describes how they are to be applied to mindfulness of each of the four establishments. These two quotes are from the definition sections of the Satipatthana and Anapanasati, and I've offered a few translations to compare. I'll just read Thay's, Thich Nhat Hanh's. Practitioners remain established in the observation diligent, with clear understanding, mindful, having abandoned every craving and every distaste for this life. And his translation of the definition from the Anapanasati is, they abide peacefully in the establishment, persevering, fully awake, clearly understanding their state, gone beyond all attachment and aversion to this life. And you can scan quickly and see that the other translations from Nanamoli and Thanissaro are similar. So here I've listed the defining characteristics out just for ease. They are observation or contemplation, which is anupasati in Pali, diligence, which is atapi in Pali, clear understanding, sampajana, mindful, sati, and non-desire, non-discontent. So we can see right away that mindfulness entails much more than a bare awareness, or simply memory. The two terms that suggest that more than bare awareness is going on are anupasati and atapi. Anupasati, meaning contemplation, is a combination of the emphatic prefix anu and pasati, which means to see. And when you put them together, the term literally means to repeatedly look at. It also conveys a sense of looking at something from many different angles, or applying differing frameworks of understanding to it. There are many kinds of contemplations mentioned throughout the discourses. Some examples of them here are contemplations of impermanence, anicca nupasi, contemplation of unsatisfactoriness, dukkha nupasi, contemplation of unattractiveness, asubha nupasi, and contemplation of not self, anatta nupasi, and contemplation of something as something to be let go of, patini saga nupasi. So we see each of these contemplations play a role in both the Satipatthana and Anapanasati, which means that the practice of mindfulness is concerned with seeing whatever comes into experience as possessing all of these qualities. Besides being more than bare awareness, these defining characteristics suggest another distinction between mindfulness, as the Buddha taught, and how it is popularly interpreted today. In the West, particularly, mindfulness meditation has been mixed with many clinical modalities, such as psychoanalysis and cognitive behavioral therapy. And these are paradigms that work by increasing perceptivity to the specific contents of awareness, so that they can be analyzed for patterns and then reality checked. And as I said before, this isn't a criticism of those practices, since they can be helpful for people seeking to alter particular destructive behaviors and thought patterns. But in meditation, the tendency to analyze the specifics of experience can result in becoming preoccupied with individual thoughts and images and memories and sensations. We think we're trying to get to the root of a phenomenon, but we just keep digging deeper and deeper with no root to be found. So from this list of contemplations, we can see that the Buddha was directing us to heed the qualities that are common to all experience. This can be described as a shift in awareness from content to general process. Once we can see that all experience really is impermanent, unsatisfactory compared to our desires, unattractive compared to our ideals, and not self, as in me or mine, and is something to be let go of, we develop disenchantment and dispassion. This is why I'm describing the liberation of mind as total unbinding, complete letting go, and not clinging to anything. The next defining characteristic I want to emphasize is atapi, translated as diligence or ardor. Atapi is related to the word atapana, which means burning, and is said to be what burns up detrimental mental qualities. So atapi could be considered as a synonym for energy, which is a quality of the factor of the Noble Eightfold Path called complete effort. Here's the Buddha's definition of complete effort. There is the case where a monk generates desire, endeavors, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the sake of the non-arising of evil, unskillful qualities that have not yet arisen. He generates desire, endeavors, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the sake of the abandonment of evil, unskillful qualities that have arisen. He generates desire, endeavors, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the sake of the arising of skillful qualities that have not yet arisen. He generates desire, endeavors, activates persistence, upholds and exerts his intent for the maintenance, non-confusion, increase, plenitude, development, and culmination of skillful qualities that have arisen. This, monks, is called right effort. So atapi is the energy that is exerted for the sake of the non-arising and abandonment of detrimental states of mind, and for the sake of the arising and persisting of beneficial states of mind. So here we can see that the definition section of the Satipatthana Sutta doesn't support the idea of non-judgment and passivity. Actually, it requires the ability to discern helpful from unhelpful thoughts, impulses, moods, and attitudes, and applying the energy needed for diminishing the unwholesome while increasing the wholesome. There are many lists of the unwholesome and wholesome throughout the discourses and commentaries, but they can all be thought of broadly as belonging to three qualities for both unwholesome and unwholesome. Greed, hatred, and delusion belonging to the unwholesome, while non-greed, non-hatred, and non-delusion belong to the wholesome. So these qualities will be specifically contemplated later on in the Satipatthana. The refrain is the section of the Satipatthana that Analayo suggests is describing how to apply mindfulness to each establishment so that it produces liberating insight. He calls it the refrain because it is repeated after each section for the body, feeling, mind states, and Dhamma. Thich Nhat Hanh translates it as, they observe the establishment from within or from without, or from both within or without. They observe the process of coming to be, or the process of dissolution, or both the process of coming to be and the process of dissolution. Or they are mindful of the fact there is an establishment here until full awareness and understanding come about. They maintain the observation free, not caught up in any worldly consideration. So the refrain of the discourse is telling us that once sati is aroused, it is to be directed to contemplating each establishment internally and externally, attentive to their impermanent nature, expressed as the process of coming to be and the process of dissolution, with an attitude of equanimity. Impermanence and non-clinging will both be covered in depth later on, so I just want to say a little bit about contemplating internally and externally. The orthodox interpretation of this point which is given in the Pali commentaries, is that one should contemplate both one's own and another person's body, feelings, and mind, regarding the characteristics mentioned in the definition. Although meditation teachers have proposed other interpretations, I think this is the most likely and useful one. Through contemplating the body and mind of others, we come to learn that there is nothing special about our own individual physiology and psychology. Whether it is mine or another person's body or mind, they are just objects in nature and are subject to the same laws of impermanence, not self, and dukkha. And this realization can actually be profoundly connecting. Because we understand suffering in ourselves, we understand suffering in others. If we deeply contemplate each establishment, both internally and externally, we can open the door to not self. We can come to see mind states like anger or pride as just energies arising that are dependent on conditions. For example, during a tense conversation, we can reflect, this isn't my anger or your anger, but it's just anger here. And this is helpful because my anger or your anger is difficult to understand, but anger as an energy that feels a certain way in the body and distorts perception is easy to understand. So we'll become less inclined to react or attack when we think what we think is the source of the anger, and instead become curious about what the anger needs to calm down. Considering the characteristics mentioned in the definition and the refrain of the satipatthana, I'd like to suggest that the modern definitions of mindfulness that we're familiar with aren't wrong, but are perhaps incomplete. Instead, I propose that practitioners who are developing mindfulness for more or less liberation of mind and freedom from frustration and disappointment begin to think of mindfulness as keeping the Dharma in mind. Again, Dharma is left untranslated so that it can refer to the set listed in the fourth establishment of mindfulness. Present moment awareness, as in the phrase dwelling happily in the present moment, Drista Dharma Sukha Vihara, and the quality of mind that enables remembering information for progressing on the path. This definition finds support in Samyutta Nikaya 46.3, where the Buddha says, dwelling thus withdrawn, one recollects that Dhamma and thinks it over. Whenever bhikkhus, a bhikkhu dwelling thus withdrawn, recollects that Dhamma and thinks it over, on that occasion the enlightenment factor of mindfulness is aroused by the bhikkhu. On that occasion the bhikkhu develops the enlightenment factor of mindfulness. On that occasion the enlightenment factor of mindfulness comes to fulfillment by development in the bhikkhu. So I'm having a little fun with words here. I'm saying I'm offering a complete definition of sati because the word sati often appears in the discourses alongside the word sama, which means complete. When we put them together, we get samasati, complete mindfulness. So here I'm just visualizing that for mindfulness to be complete, it must contain the characteristics we've gone over so far: contemplation, diligence, clear understanding, mindfulness, and non-desire, non-discontent. One other quick note, another example of the word sama meaning complete is sama sambodhi, which means complete awakening, which was one title given to the Buddha. Samasati is itself only one factor of a complete path, called the Noble Eightfold Path. And I'll just say a few things about the terms and graphics here for folks who are used to the Plum Village framework. First, I'm going with complete as a translation for sama rather than right, because that's what the term literally means. I also think it adds a helpful dimension to the practice to think of developing each factor on the path completely rather than rightly. And second, Plum Village practitioners will notice the second factor listed as complete resolve rather than right thinking. Some other traditions name it right intention. And each of these can be correct. In the Samyutta Nikaya 45.8, the Buddha defines the second factor as, and what is right resolve? Being resolved on renunciation, on freedom from ill will, on harmlessness. This is called right resolve. And in the Anguttara Nikaya 10.176, the Buddha relates the second factor to cultivating skillful ways of thinking. And how is one made pure in 3 ways by mental action? There is the case where a certain person is not covetous. He does not covet the belongings of others, thinking, oh, that what belongs to others would be mine. He bears no ill will and is not caught in the resolves of his heart. Corrupt. He is not corrupt in the resolves of his heart. He thinks, may these beings be free from animosity, free from oppression, free from trouble, and may they look after themselves with ease. He has right view and is not warped in the way he sees things. We can see how each factor logically implies the other factors. When we have complete view of the way things are, we naturally set our hearts upon harmlessness. For our practice to be complete, our speech, actions, and livelihood must align with harmlessness. The path of mindfulness thus absolutely contains an ethical dimension, which in the Plum Village tradition we express as the 5 mindfulness trainings, being reverence for life, generosity, responsible intimacy, deep listening and loving speech, and abstaining from consumables that are toxic to body, mind, society, and earth. This requires us to be energetic in uprooting the habits of mind that take us toward harm and nourishing habits that produce wellness. The role of mindfulness is to monitor thoughts, speech, and actions, heedful of any steps that begin to wander off the path. Mindfulness is also what reminds us of the inherent impermanent, not self, and unsatisfactory nature of experience. And convinced of these 3 aspects, the mind stabilizes, since it sees that no experience is worth chasing after or running from. Notice how this chart shows complete concentration, circling back to complete view. That's because the discourses describe 2 kinds of complete view. At first, we need a correct conceptual understanding of the Buddha's teaching. We need to comprehend where the path is going and how to walk on it. And then, as many discourses say, concentration gives rise to knowledge and vision of things as they are. This is complete view that can't be captured in concepts, since all concepts fall short of completely describing reality. And this is the view that releases the mind from its bounded condition. Another way of representing this process is the 7 factors of awakening, which the Buddha describes in the Anapanasati Sutta. Moreover, if they are developed and continuously practiced, the 4 establishments of mindfulness will lead to perfect abiding in the 7 factors of awakening. How is this so? When practitioners can maintain, without distraction, the practice of observing the body in the body, the feelings in the feelings, the mind in the mind, and the objects of mind in the objects of mind, persevering, fully awake, clearly understanding their state, gone beyond all attachment and aversion to this life, with unwavering, steadfast, imperturbable meditative stability, they will attain the first factor of awakening, namely mindfulness. When this factor is developed, it will come to perfection. When practitioners can abide in meditative stability without being distracted, and can investigate every dharma, every object of mind that arises, then the second factor of awakening will be born and developed, the factor of investigating dharmas. When this factor is developed, it will come to perfection. When practitioners can observe and investigate every dharma in a sustained, persevering, and steadfast way, without being distracted, the third factor of awakening will be born and developed, the factor of energy. When this factor is developed, it will come to perfection. When practitioners have reached a stable, imperturbable abiding in the stream of practice, the fourth factor of awakening will be born and developed, the factor of joy. When this factor is developed, it will come to perfection. When practitioners can abide undistractedly in the state of joy, they will feel their bodies and minds light and at peace. At this point, the fifth factor of awakening will be born and developed, the factor of ease. When this factor is developed, it will come to perfection. When both body and mind are at ease, practitioners can easily enter into concentration. At this point, the sixth factor of awakening will be born and developed, the factor of concentration. When this factor is developed, it will come to perfection. When practitioners are abiding in concentration with deep calm, they will cease discriminating and comparing. At this point, the seventh factor of awakening is released, born, and developed, the factor of letting go. When this factor is developed, it will come to perfection. This is how the four establishments of mindfulness, if developed and practiced continuously, will lead to perfect abiding in the seven factors of awakening. Okay, so that's what we're going to try to do in this course. No biggie. It's perfectly manageable. I'm sure whether we make it to full awakening or not, we'll learn some valuable teachings to help guide us in our practice. Luckily, the Buddha left us detailed instructions in the form of the satipatthana and anapanasati suttas. The rest of this course will be for following those instructions, specifically practicing each of the techniques given in both discourses. So you can see those all listed here, several for each establishment of mindfulness, namely body, feeling, mind states, and Dhamma. Since we'll be experiencing them in guided meditation and formless daily practice, you're encouraged to enjoy the guided meditation offered in this chapter so that you'll be familiar with the method before moving on to the next lesson. Thank you for stepping on this path, and I'm looking forward to walking it with you. Some reading materials if you're interested. See you next time.